The Haunted Road. A man's guilt that never dies. In a chilling and tragic story of guilt, consequence, and supernatural retribution, Luke, a troubled man, stumbles down a path of crime and terror. After spending his youth entangled with drugs and bad company, he is offered an opportunity to earn quick cash working for a shady associate. On a fateful night, while driving a delivery truck, Luke accidentally hits a young woman on a desolate road. Panic-stricken and pushed by his ruthless partner, he helps conceal the crime by burying her body. What follows is a haunting series of events as Luke's conscience and fear catch up to him. He begins experiencing terrifying visions of the woman he killed. The ghost appears relentlessly, driving Luke into madness. In desperation, Luke seeks the help of a spiritualist who confirms his worst fear the vengeful spirit is real. As the weight of his sins bears down on him, Luke faces the terrifying question: will he ever escape the ghost's wrath, or has his path of guilt sealed his fate? The story builds to a dramatic and eerie conclusion, where Luke is forced to make impossible choices, both to save his soul and make amends for his past. Part 1. The Burden of Guilt. Luke gripped the steering wheel of the old truck, knuckles white with tension. His mind was a swirling mess of regret and frustration, punctuated by the occasional flicker of dread. Every time he worked for Jack, that familiar unease would rise up in his chest like a bitter taste he couldn't swallow. Tonight was no different. The weight of his dark past bore down on him, an invisible chain that kept pulling him deeper into a life he had long tried to escape. But there was no escaping Jack. Once you were in for good. The road ahead stretched out like a thin thread of black, barely illuminated by the weak beams of the truck's headlights. The night air was thick, the kind of dampness that stuck to your skin, making everything feel heavier. Luke's hands were sweating on the wheel, but the cold breeze that slipped through the cracked window did nothing to cool him down. Just one more run, he muttered to himself. One more job, then I'm out. He knew it was a lie. He'd said the same thing after the last job and the one before that. But there was always something pulling him back in: the money, the need to survive, or the quiet but insistent fear that Jack wasn't someone you just walked away from. Hey, keep your eyes on the road, Luke. Jack barked from the passenger seat, his voice sharp and impatient. Luke flinched. Jack's presence was like a shadow that loomed over everything. There was something cold in Jack's eyes, something ruthless that made Luke feel uneasy. Jack always had a way of making things seem casual, even when they were life and death. Especially when they were life and death. Luke didn't respond, just nodded and tried to shake off the creeping anxiety tightening in his chest. The roads were quiet this time of night, only the occasional flash of headlights in the distance. They were out here for another one of Jack's shady deals: a simple pickup and delivery. That's what Jack always called it, simple. But nothing with Jack was ever simple, not really. It was supposed to be a smooth job: drive out, load the cargo, head back and collect the cash. But tonight something felt different. Luke couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. That's when he saw her. Out of nowhere, a figure appeared on the road ahead, a flash of movement against the darkness. Luke's heart jolted in his chest as he slammed on the brakes. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching on the wet asphalt, but it was too late. Thud, the sickening sound reverberated through the truck, a dull, hollow impact that Luke felt in his bones. His heart pounded in his ears as the truck came to a jerking halt. Jesus, what the hell was that? Jack snarled, leaning forward in his seat to peer through the windshield. Luke's breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling as he slowly unfastened his seatbelt. His stomach churned. He knew what had happened. He knew it deep in his gut, even though his mind screamed for him to deny it. I think I hit someone, Luke whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack's face twisted into an ugly scowl. What the hell do you mean you hit someone? It's the middle of the goddamn night. There's no one out here. But Luke wasn't listening. His hands were already on the door handle, fumbling as he pushed it open and stumbled out of the truck. The night air hit him like a punch, cold and wet, but his body felt like it was on fire. His legs wobbled as he took a few shaky steps forward, heart racing so fast he thought it might explode in his chest. There, lying motionless on the ground in front of the truck, was the body of a young woman. Her limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, her hair splayed out in a dark halo around her pale face. Her eyes, wide open, stared blankly into the night sky, reflecting the faint glimmer of the stars above. Luke's stomach turned. He staggered backward, bile rising in his throat. Oh God, he whispered, his voice cracking with panic. Jack was beside him in an instant, grabbing him by the collar and shaking him hard. Pull it together, Jack hissed through gritted teeth, his face inches from Luke's. We don't have time for this. Do you understand? No one has to know, Jack continued, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. We take care of it, right here. Right now, Luke's mind raced, torn between the crushing guilt and the icy fear that had taken root in his chest. He looked down at the woman's body again, bile rising in his throat. She was so still, so silent. This wasn't who he wanted to be. He had tried so hard to escape this life, to put his past behind him. But now it was all catching up with him, dragging him down into a pit of guilt and regret. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating. But there was no going back. Not now. Swallowing the bile in his throat, Luke nodded stiffly. Jack released his grip and gestured to the back of the truck. Let's get this over with. The night dragged on in a blur of horror and dread as Luke and Jack worked to bury the woman's body in a shallow grave by the side of the road. Every shovel of dirt felt like another nail in the coffin of Luke's soul. He could barely think, barely breathe, as the reality of what they were doing sank in. By the time they were finished, Luke's hands were raw, his body aching with exhaustion. He stared down at the mound of freshly turned earth, bile rising in his throat again. The weight of what they had done settled on him like a heavy cloak, suffocating and cold. Jack, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He wiped his hands on his jeans, already turning back toward the truck, as if nothing had happened. We never speak of this again, Jack said, his voice flat and emotionless. Got it, Luke nodded numbly, his throat too tight to speak. As they drove away, the road stretching endlessly ahead, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. Something dark and cold, like the shadow of death itself. He glanced in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the woman's face staring back at him, her lifeless eyes boring into his soul. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind them fading into the darkness. Yet the weight of her death clung to him like a curse, and Luke knew deep down that this was far from over. The crime was buried, but the guilt was alive and well, festering inside him like a wound that would never heal. And no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he ran, he could never escape it. Part 2. Haunted by the past. Luke thought he could leave it behind. The grave, hastily dug in the cold, wet earth, had swallowed her up, and with her his guilt, or so he had hoped. But as the days wore on, something gnawed at him, a dark unease that twisted in his gut and wrapped itself around his chest. He tried to push it away, to drown it with work, noise, and alcohol. But no matter what he did, he couldn't outrun the feeling. It started with the dreams. At first they were fleeting, flashes of her face pale, lifeless, her eyes dull and glassy, haunting the edges of his consciousness as he drifted into sleep. He would see her standing in the distance, far off, just out of focus. Her form would shimmer in the fog of his dreams, distorted like a reflection in a cracked mirror. Each time he tried to move toward her, his body would freeze, trapped in a terrifying paralysis, while she stood there, silently watching him with those dead eyes. Luke would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding against his ribs, his sheets twisted and damp beneath him. At first he told himself it was just guilt. He had never killed anyone before, not like that, not by accident. It made sense that she was haunting his dreams. But it was just a dream. She was buried. She was gone. Or so he thought. The dreams persisted, growing more vivid, more sinister with each passing night. What had once been fleeting glimpses of her face soon turned into something far darker. The dreams took on a life of their own, dragging Luke into a twisted, nightmarish version of reality that he could no longer control. In his dreams, the air would turn thick and suffocating, like he was trapped underwater. He would see her again, standing there, but now she was closer, her features more distinct, more terrible. Her skin was unnaturally pale, the color drained from her face, as if she had been lying in the grave for far too long. Her clothes were torn, and dark patches of dirt and blood clung to her body, but it was her eyes that terrified him the most, wide open, lifeless, and staring directly at him. Luke, her voice would rasp in his head, soft but piercing, like a whisper carried on the wind. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't run. His body would lock up as if the weight of her death had anchored him in place, trapping him in his own mind. He would try to scream, but no sound would come, and always she would take a step closer. It didn't matter how many times he woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The moment he closed his eyes, she was there again, pulling him back into the nightmare. One night, the dream was different. It began the same way. Luke was standing in the middle of a dark road, the headlights of the truck beaming down an endless stretch of asphalt. The night was cold, but his skin felt clammy, as if the cold was seeping into his bones. In the distance, he saw her, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, her figure barely visible in the mist. He tried to move, but his legs felt like lead rooted to the spot. The fog thickened around him, swirling in the beams of light like smoke. He blinked, and in that split second, she was gone. The road ahead was empty. For a moment, he felt relief. Maybe the dream would end. Maybe he had finally buried the memory deep enough. But then, the sound. A low, scraping noise echoed from behind him, like the slow drag of metal on pavement. His heart stopped. Luke's entire body tensed, fear rippling through him in waves. He didn't want to turn around. He couldn't. But something, an invisible force, like icy fingers wrapping around his spine, compelled him to move. Slowly he turned his head, the world around him darkening with every inch. There she was, standing just inches behind him. Her face was pale as death, her skin taut and cracked, dirt and blood streaking her cheeks. Her once bright eyes were sunken and hollow, as if something had drained the life out of her long ago. Her mouth was slightly open, her lips dry and chapped, and from her throat came a low, guttural sound, like the death rattle of a creature far beyond saving. "Luke," she whispered again, her voice rattling through the air like dry leaves scraping across the ground. Luke's breath caught in his throat. His legs trembled, but he couldn't move. He was trapped in her gaze, his entire body frozen as her hand reached out toward him. Her fingers were long and bony, her nails dirty and chipped, and as they inched closer, he could feel the air around him grow colder, heavier. "No," he screamed, breaking free of the paralysis in a violent surge of panic. He stumbled backward, his body trembling as he tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move fast enough. He could hear her breathing now, a ragged, shallow sound, as if the weight of death itself was pulling her down. And then her hand gripped his wrist. The touch was cold, so cold it burned, like ice pressed against his skin. His heart pounded against his ribs, terror coursing through his veins. He could feel her pulling him, dragging him down into the darkness. "Luke," she hissed again, her voice filling his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. He thrashed, desperate to break free, but the more he struggled, the tighter her grip became. He could feel her nails digging into his skin, tearing at him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. Then, with a jolt, he woke up. Luke sat bolt upright in bed, gasping for breath. His heart was racing, his skin slick with sweat. The room was dark, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside. For a moment he sat there frozen, his mind still reeling from the dream. It had felt so real. He could still feel her touch on his wrist, cold and painful, as if she had followed him out of the dream and into reality. He glanced down at his arm, and his breath caught in his throat. There on his wrist were faint, red marks like the outline of fingers. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just guilt anymore. This wasn't just his mind playing tricks on him. Something was happening. Something far worse than he could have imagined. Luke's nights became a waking nightmare. Sleep was no longer a refuge, it was a trap. Every time he closed his eyes, she was there waiting for him, pulling him back into the darkness. But it didn't stop with the dreams. She started appearing when he was awake. At first it was just flashes out of the corner of his eye. He would catch a glimpse of her standing in the shadows, her lifeless eyes watching him. He would turn, and she would be gone, leaving only a cold chill in the air. But then she started getting closer. Luke would be sitting at the bar, trying to drown his guilt in whiskey, when he'd feel a presence behind him. He'd turn, and there she would be, standing at the far end of the room, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes locked onto his. He'd blink, and she'd vanish, leaving him breathless and shaking. He couldn't escape her. No matter where he went, no matter how far he tried to run, she was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting for the moment he let his guard down. He stopped sleeping. He stopped going out. The darkness inside his apartment became his only refuge, but even there he wasn't safe. One night, as he sat in the dim light of his living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, he heard it again, the low, scraping noise, like nails dragging across the floor. His heart pounded in his chest, and he froze, the glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. Slowly he turned his head toward the sound, and there she was crawling toward him. Her body was twisted and broken, her limbs bent at unnatural angles, her hair matted with blood and dirt. Her eyes, wide and empty, stared up at him as she dragged herself across the floor, her nails scraping against the hardwood with a sickening sound. Luke, her voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the room, echoing in his head like a death knell. He stood, stumbling backward, his legs shaking. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to get away, but she was everywhere. No matter where he turned, she was there, her broken body following him, her dead eyes locked onto him. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "Please, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," but she didn't stop. She kept coming, her body dragging itself closer and closer, her hand reaching out for him once again. Luke's vision blurred with tears, his heart pounding in his chest as he backed himself into a corner. There was nowhere left to run. He was trapped, and she was coming for him. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please forgive me." The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was her face, pale, lifeless, and full of vengeance. And then everything went black. When Luke woke up, he was lying on the floor, his body cold and trembling. His head throbbed with pain, and his heart was still racing in his chest. The room was silent, but the fear lingered like a heavy fog, clinging to every corner. She was gone for now, but he knew she would be back. She always came back. There was no escaping her. She would haunt him forever, a living reminder of the life he had taken. And deep down, Luke knew the truth, he deserved it. Part 3. A fatal mistake. The truck's engine rumbled through the silence of the night, the low, constant hum vibrating through Luke's bones as he gripped the steering wheel with shaking hands. It was another late run, another job with Jack that promised easy money, but carried the weight of everything Luke wanted to leave behind. The darkness outside was thick, pressing against the windows of the truck like a living thing, and the road stretched endlessly ahead, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights. The deeper into the night they drove, the more the shadows seemed to grow, twisting and curling in the corners of Luke's vision. Jack, lounging casually in the passenger seat, took a long drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke lazily toward the window. The faint orange glow of the cigarette's tip was the only light inside the truck, casting eerie shadows across Jack's sharp features. He looked completely at ease, as though they weren't driving through the same dark, empty roads that had become the backdrop of Luke's nightmares. Luke envied him the ease with which Jack seemed to shrug off everything that had happened, the way he acted as if nothing had changed since that terrible night when they buried her body in the cold, unforgiving earth. Luke hadn't been able to forget. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how many jobs they did, the memory clung to him like a parasite, feeding off his fear, his guilt. Every time he closed his eyes, she was there. And now, even when he was awake, he could feel her watching him, her presence lingering just out of sight, always at the edge of his mind. The weight of it was suffocating, and the more he tried to push it away, the more it consumed him. Luke Jack's voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade, jolting Luke from his spiraling thoughts. "You good, man? You've been driving like a zombie." Luke's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the tension in his voice was unmistakable. Jack raised an eyebrow, exhaling another plume of smoke. "You sure? You've been acting weird for weeks now. You gotta let it go, man. It's done. No one knows, no one saw. It's over." Luke's stomach churned. He wanted to believe Jack, wanted to convince himself that it was truly over, that they had gotten away with it. But deep down he knew it wasn't. She wasn't gone. He could feel her, like a shadow hanging over him, dark and cold. He could feel her watching. "Yeah," Luke said, his voice hollow. "It's over." The light tasted bitter in his mouth. The road ahead stretched on, winding through the dense woods that flanked both sides. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, barely visible in the headlights' dim glow. The air inside the truck felt heavy, thick with the kind of tension that only comes when something terrible is about to happen. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, a dull, insistent rhythm that matched the pounding in his head. He tried to focus on the road, to push away the gnawing fear that clawed at the edges of his mind, but it was no use. Something was coming. The silence inside the truck was unbearable, broken only by the soft crackle of Jack's cigarette and the hum of the engine. Luke's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat as he half expected to see a face staring back at him from the darkness. But the back of the truck was empty, just shadows and the faint outline of their cargo. Focused Luke muttered to himself, forcing his eyes back to the road. Just focus. But then, as the truck rounded a curve in the road, Luke's blood turned to ice. There she was, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the truck's headlights, was the woman. The woman he had killed. Her pale, lifeless face stared directly at him, her eyes wide and hollow, her dark hair hanging tangled strands around her gaunt, blood-streaked face. Her clothes were torn, stained with mud and blood, and her arms hung limply at her sides. But it was her eyes that froze Luke in place, those wide, empty eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him, accusing him, haunting him. Luke's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat, panic surging through him like ice water in his veins. He slammed on the brakes, except, in his panic, his foot missed the brake entirely and hit the gas instead. The truck lurched forward, accelerating toward the woman standing in the road. "Jesus, Luke, what the hell are you doing?" Jack shouted, grabbing the dashboard as the truck sped up. But Luke couldn't stop. His eyes were locked on her, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles arced. The woman didn't move. She stood there, perfectly still, her dead eyes watching him as the truck barreled toward her. "Stop the damn truck," Jack screamed, reaching over to grab the wheel. But Luke was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of her. His mind screamed at him to stop, to brake, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare, watching helplessly as the truck hurtled toward her. And then, just as the truck was about to hit her, she vanished. Gone. Luke gasped, his foot finally finding the brake and slamming it to the floor. The truck screeched to a halt, the tires skidding on the asphalt as the world seemed to spin around him. His heart pounded in his ears, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the empty road ahead. There was nothing there, no woman, no body, just darkness. "What the hell is wrong with you, man?" Jack's voice was sharp, angry, but tinged with something else, fear. Luke blinked, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He turned to Jack, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you see her?" Jack's eyes narrowed, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. "See who?" "There's no one there, Luke." "You're losing it." Luke's heart raced, his mind spinning in 1,000 directions. No one there? How could he say that? He had seen her. She was right there, standing in the middle of the road. He wasn't imagining it. He couldn't be. She was real. She was right there. I saw her, Luke muttered, his voice trembling. She was right there, standing in the road. Jack shook his head, rubbing his face with one hand. You're saying things, man. There's no one there. It's just your guilt messing with your head. But Luke knew what he saw. He knew it wasn't just in his head. It wasn't just guilt. She was there. She was haunting him. And she wanted something. Jack cursed under his breath, lighting another cigarette with shaking hands. You need to get a grip, Luke. You keep freaking out like this, and you're gonna get us both killed. But Luke wasn't listening. His eyes were glued to the road, scanning the darkness for any sign of her. He could feel her presence, lingering just beyond the reach of the headlights, watching him, waiting for him to slip up. His breath came in shallow gasps as paranoia tightened its grip around his throat. She was out there. He knew it. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. Jack kept talking, his voice a constant drone in the background, but Luke barely heard him. His mind was consumed with thoughts of her, where she had gone, why she had appeared, and what she wanted. His hands trembled on the wheel, his eyes flicking constantly between the road and the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing behind the truck, her lifeless eyes staring at him through the glass. But there was nothing. Just shadows. Just the night. By the time they reached their destination, Luke's nerves were frayed, his entire body tense with fear and exhaustion. Jack hopped out of the truck, cursing under his breath about Luke's episode. But Luke stayed behind, his hand still gripping the wheel as he stared blankly at the dashboard. She was real. He knew she was. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't losing it. But the more he tried to convince himself, the more doubt crept in. Jack hadn't seen her. No one else had. Maybe it really was just in his head. Maybe it was just the guilt eating away at him, turning his mind against him. But deep down, in the darkest corner of his mind, Luke knew the truth. She was haunting him, and she wasn't going to stop. That night, Luke didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the shadows of his apartment, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, sent a jolt of fear through his body. He knew she would come. She always did. The hours dragged on, the darkness pressing in around him, suffocating him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow and uneven. He could feel her watching him, waiting for the moment he let his guard down. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, he saw her. She stood at the foot of his bed, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the morning light. Her eyes, wide and hollow, stared directly at him, filled with an endless, terrible sorrow. "Luke," she whispered, her voice a soft, haunting echo that filled the room. Luke's heart stopped. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He could only stare, his breath caught in his throat, as she slowly raised one hand, reaching out toward him. And then she was gone. The air in the room was cold, the weight of her presence still lingering like a shadow. Luke collapsed back onto the bed, his body trembling, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. He knew now without a doubt that she wasn't going to stop. She wanted something. And until he figured out what, she wasn't going anywhere. Part 4. The ghost revealed. The darkness of Luke's apartment had become a suffocating cocoon, wrapping tighter around him with every passing night. He'd sealed off every window, drawn the curtains, and turned off all the lights, but none of it mattered. No matter how deep into the shadows he withdrew, she was always there, waiting, watching. The night after he had seen her on the road after Jack had brushed it off as nothing but a delusion, Luke had spiraled further into paranoia. He barely left his apartment anymore, afraid of what might follow him if he stepped outside. Each creak in the floorboards, each gust of wind rattling the windows, sent cold jolts of terror through him. He had become a prisoner in his own home, a man haunted not just by his past but by something far darker. It wasn't just in his mind anymore. He knew it. He felt her presence growing stronger, closer. She was no longer content to appear only in his dreams. She had broken free of that barrier, and now she invaded his waking moments. He could feel her, like a shadow creeping across the room, brushing against his skin. His breath would catch in his throat, and his pulse would quicken as a chill wrapped itself around him. The first time she appeared in his bedroom, Luke had convinced himself it was just another dream. He had woken in the dead of night, his body drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. For a moment he was disoriented, blinking through the darkness, trying to shake the remnants of the nightmare from his mind. But then he saw her. She stood at the foot of his bed, her figure barely visible in the dim light. Her clothes hung in tattered shreds, caked with dirt and blood, as though she had just crawled out of the grave. Her face was pale, gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her bones. Dark streaks of blood ran down her cheeks, pooling in the hollow of her eyes, which were wide and unblinking, fixed on him with a gaze that chilled him to the core. Luke, her voice was a raspy whisper, as though it was dragged from the depths of a long-forgotten grave. "You took my life." Luke couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped him. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears that it drowned out everything else. He wanted to scream, to bolt from the bed and run, but his body refused to obey him. The woman the ghost took a step closer, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Blood dripped from her fingertips, splattering onto the floor as she moved. Her face was a mask of sorrow and rage, and Luke could feel the weight of her anger pressing down on him, suffocating him. "You killed me," she whispered again, her voice laced with venom. "And now I will take your life in return." Luke's mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. His chest tightened, his lungs burning as though he had forgotten how to breathe. The room felt impossibly small, the air thick and heavy, as though it were closing in on him. He could feel the cold radiating from her, chilling him to the bone. Her eyes, they were dead, empty. Yet they were filled with so much pain, so much hate, that Luke felt as though he was being pulled into them, drawn into them, that endless abyss of darkness that she had come from. "I didn't mean to." Luke's voice was a broken whisper, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "It was an accident." The ghost's lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing teeth stained red with blood. Her head tilted slightly, her long matted hair falling over one side of her face like a shroud. She raised a hand, her fingers stained with dirt and gore, and pointed directly at him. "Accident," she hissed, her voice sharp and jagged, like the sound of nails scraping against glass. "You buried me. You left me there." Forgotten. Luke's chest tightened further, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. The edges of his vision blurred, the room spinning around him. He could feel her words digging into him like icy claws, dragging him deeper into his own guilt. She was right. He had buried her. He had left her there, alone in the cold earth, and now she had come back for him. The ghost moved closer, her feet barely touching the ground as she glided toward him, her eyes never leaving his. Luke tried to back away, tried to pull himself out of bed, but his body was frozen, locked in place by the weight of his fear. "You took everything from me," she whispered, her voice now soft, almost mournful. "And now, I will take everything from you." With those words, she reached out, her hand brushing against his foot at the edge of the bed. The cold was unlike anything Luke had ever felt. It wasn't just the kind of cold that made you shiver or reach for a blanket. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, freezing you from the inside out. It burned, a sharp, biting pain that shot up his leg, paralyzing him further. His muscles tensed, his breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he thought he might never move again. Her touch spread the chill through his body like poison, creeping up his leg, wrapping around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. Luke's vision blurred further, his heart pounding so fast it felt as though it might burst from his chest. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All he could feel was the cold and the overwhelming terror that consumed him. "You can't escape me," the ghost whispered, her voice soft but filled with a terrible finality. "I will always be here, watching, waiting, until you pay for what you did." Her hand moved up, brushing against his arm, and Luke's entire body went numb. The cold had consumed him completely, turning his limbs to stone, locking him in place as she loomed over him, her dead eyes boring into his. "Please," Luke gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Please." Don't. The ghost's lips twitched, her smile widening into something grotesque, something inhuman. "You don't get to beg, Luke. Not after what you did." With that, she leaned in closer, her face inches from his. Luke could feel her breath on his skin, cold and rotten, like the smell of decay. Her eyes gleamed with malice, her hand tightening around his arm, pulling him deeper into the suffocating cold. "You're mine now," she whispered, her voice a deathly rasp. "And you'll never escape me," Luke's body composed, his muscles tightening as the cold wrapped around his chest, squeezing the life from him. He tried to scream, tried to thrash against her grip, but it was no use. The cold was too strong. The fear was too overwhelming. His vision darkened, the edges of the room fading into blackness as her face loomed over him, her dead, lifeless eyes staring into his very soul. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The weight lifted from Luke's chest, and he gasped, his lungs burning as he drew in a ragged breath. His body shook uncontrollably, his muscles weak and trembling as he tried to sit up. The cold lingered, a biting chill that clung to his skin, but the ghost. She was gone, for now. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming short, desperate gasps as he clutched the edge of the bed, his knuckles white. His entire body was drenched in sweat, his clothes sticking to his skin, but all he could feel was the cold. That terrible, bone-deep cold that she had left behind. His mind raced at his thoughts tangled in a web of fear and confusion. What had just happened? Had it been real? Had she really been here in his room touching him, freezing him from the inside out? Or was it just another nightmare? But as Luke glanced down at his arm, he saw the truth staring back at him. There, on his skin, were the faint, bruised outlines of her fingers wrapped around his arm, marking him with the proof of her presence. She was real. And she wasn't going to stop. The days that followed were a blur of terror and exhaustion. Luke barely slept, afraid of what might happen if he closed his eyes for too long. The apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in on him as her presence grew stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment he let his guard down. She appeared again the next night, and the night after that. Each time she was more terrifying, more vivid. Her face became more twisted, her eyes more hollow, her voice more filled with rage. She would stand at the foot of his bed, watching him, whispering the same accusations over and over again. "You killed me. You left me now. I'll take your life." Luke could barely function anymore. His mind was a fog of fear and paranoia, every shadow, every noise sending jolts of terror to him. He jumped at every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows. He knew she was coming. He could feel her, like a cold hand pressing against his chest, squeezing his heart. He couldn't escape her. No matter how hard he tried, no matter what he did, she was always there, watching, waiting. And Luke knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before she took what she wanted. In his life. Part 5. Seeking help. The air in Luke's apartment had grown thick with fear, a palpable tension that clung to every surface like a creeping, invisible mold. The walls seemed to close in on him more and more with each passing day, and even the faintest noise would send his heart racing, his mind spiraling back to the ghost who now haunted every waking moment of his life. It had been weeks since the first night he saw her, standing at the foot of his bed, her dead eyes locked on him with a rage that seemed to burn through the very fabric of reality. Since then, her presence had only grown stronger, more terrifying. She was no longer just an apparition in his dreams. She was here, in the real world, her cold fingers leaving bruises on his skin, her whispers echoing in his ears long after she had vanished into the shadows. Luke could barely function. Sleep was a distant memory, and when he did manage to close his eyes, he would wake drenched in sweat, his pulse pounding in his throat as her voice filled his mind. "You killed me, Luke. You took my life. Now, I'll take yours." It was too much. The weight of her accusations, The guilt gnawing at him from the inside out, it was driving him to the brink of madness. He had tried to block her out, to drown himself in alcohol, but nothing worked. She was always there, always watching, always waiting. He couldn't escape her. He knew that now. And so, desperate and terrified, Luke found himself sitting across from a spiritualist, a man whose reputation for dealing with the supernatural had spread through whispers in the darker corners of town. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of incense, and the walls were lined with old books and strange relics. The spiritualist, an older man with deep-set eyes and a calm demeanor, sat across from Luke at a small wooden table, studying him with quiet intensity. Luke shifted nervously in his seat, his hands trembling as he wiped sweat from his brow. He hadn't told anyone about the ghost, hadn't told anyone about the woman he had killed. But now, sitting here, the words tumbled out of him in a rush of guilt and fear. I didn't mean to kill her, Luke stammered, his voice barely a whisper. It was an accident. I swear it was an accident. The spiritualist nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he listened to Luke's frantic confession. And you buried her, the spiritualist said softly, his voice calm, but edged with something darker. You left her in the earth without a proper burial, without any acknowledgement of her life. Luke swallowed hard, his throat dry. Yes, he whispered, shame twisting in his gut. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. Jack, he said we had to hide her. No one could know. The spiritualist's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Jack, but he didn't press the matter. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Luke's with a seriousness that sent a shiver down Luke's spine. She haunts you now, the spiritualist said, his voice low and steady. Her spirit is bound to you, Luke. She seeks justice. Revenge. Luke's heart pounded in his chest. He had known it, deep down. He had felt her presence, felt the cold fury that radiated from her every time she appeared. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing someone confirm that what he was experiencing was real, sent a wave of terror crashing over him. Is there anything I can do? Luke asked, his voice shaking. I can't take this anymore. I can't sleep. I can't think. She's always there, watching me, waiting to take your life, the spiritualist finished for him, his voice chillingly calm. Yes, that is her goal, Luke. You took her life, and now she will take yours, unless you do something to stop her. Luke's stomach dropped, and for a moment he thought he might be sick. The spiritualist's words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Luke could feel the weight of his guilt pressing down on him even harder. What can I do? Luke asked, desperation clawing at his voice. How do I stop her? The spiritualist leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Luke. There is only one way to break the curse, Luke, he said slowly. You must make amends. You must confess what you have done and seek forgiveness from her and from those who knew her. Luke's breath caught in his throat. Confess? The thought sent a jolt of panic through him. If he confessed, if he told the truth about what had happened, he would go to prison. He would lose everything. But then again, what did he have left to lose? His life was already in ruins. He couldn't live like this, haunted by her every waking moment, knowing that she was coming for him. But Luke hesitated, his voice trembling. What if she doesn't forgive me? What if? What if it's not enough? The spiritualist's gaze softened just slightly as he nodded. It may not be, he admitted. But it's the only chance you have, Luke. If you don't seek forgiveness, her spirit will continue to haunt you until it drives you mad, or worse, until she takes your life in retribution. Luke's heart raced, fear and guilt warring inside him. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a vice, squeezing the air from his lungs. He didn't want to go to prison. He didn't want to face the consequences of what he had done. But the alternative, living in constant fear, being hunted by her spirit until the end, was unbearable. I don't know if I can do it, Luke whispered, his voice barely audible. You must, the spiritualist said firmly. There is no other way. Confess your crime, seek forgiveness, and perhaps, just perhaps, you may find peace. Luke's mind raced, the room spinning around him as the gravity of the situation settled in. Confess. tell the truth, it sounded so simple, and yet it felt impossible. How could he face what he had done? How could he look into the eyes of her family, her friends, and admit that he had killed her, that he had buried her in the cold earth and left her to rot? But there was no other choice. Luke's voice cracked as he struggled to form the words. "I'll do it. I'll confess." The spiritualist nodded solemnly, as though he had been expecting this all along. "Good," he said quietly. "But you must be prepared, Luke. The path ahead will not be easy. She will test you. She will try to break you before you can make things right." Luke swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he clenched them in his lap. "What do I need to do?" The spiritualist stood, moving toward a small cabinet at the back of the room. He opened it carefully, retrieving a small vial of some kind of liquid and a bundle of dried herbs. As he returned to the table, he placed the items in front of Luke. "These will help protect you in the coming days," the spiritualist said, his voice calm but serious. "Burn the herbs at night and drink this before you sleep. It will keep her at bay temporarily." Luke nodded, his throat tight with fear. "And then, you must prepare to face her," the spiritualist replied. "You must go to her grave, Luke. Return to the place where you buried her. There you will offer your confession. Speak to her, admit what you've done, and beg for her forgiveness." The thought of returning to that place, the place where it had all gone wrong, sent a shiver of terror down Luke's spine. He had buried her there in the cold, dark earth, and now he was supposed to go back and face her. It felt like a death sentence. Do I have to?" Luke stammered, his voice shaking. "Can't I just confess somewhere else?" "Anywhere but there." The spiritualist's expression hardened. "No, it must be at her grave. You must face her where it all began, or the curse will never be lifted." Luke's heart pounded in his chest, his mind reeling with fear. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to hide, to forget about all of this. But he knew that wasn't an option. She wouldn't let him go, not until he had paid for what he had done. "Okay," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll go." The spiritualist nodded once more, his gaze softening. "May the spirits be with you, Luke." You will need their guidance. As Luke stood to leave, his hands still trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just signed his own death warrant. The weight of the ghost's presence pressed down on him, even in the safety of the spiritualist's room, and he knew without a doubt that she was waiting for him to return, waiting for him to confess, waiting for him to pay for the life he had taken. And Luke knew deep in his soul that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, she would never truly forgive him, not until she had taken everything. Part 6. Confronting the past. The wind howled through the trees, whipping around Luke like invisible claws, biting into his skin with every gust. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, a chilling reminder of what lay beneath his feet. Each step he took toward the site felt like a march to the gallows, every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn back, to run, to escape the nightmare he had brought upon himself. But there was no escaping this, not anymore. The night was pitch black, save for the dim light of the moon that occasionally broke through the swirling clouds overhead. Luke's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat of dread. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, slick with sweat despite the cold. He could barely see the path ahead, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly where he was going. He had walked this path before. The memory of that night flooded his mind, playing out in vivid, horrifying detail. The woman's lifeless body, cold and limp, as he and Jack had lowered her into the shallow grave they had dug in a frenzy. The sound of dirt hitting her body, the dull thud as they covered her, as if they could bury their guilt along with her. He had tried to forget, to push the memory deep into the recesses of his mind where it couldn't reach him, but now it clawed its way to the surface, refusing to be silenced. And she was still there, her ghost, haunting him. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, she followed, her presence a constant reminder of the life he had stolen. Luke's footsteps slowed as he neared the clearing, his heart stuttering in his chest as he saw the mound of disturbed earth where they had buried her. The trees loomed over him like silent witnesses, their branches twisting in the wind, casting eerie shadows across the ground. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring at the grave, unable to move any closer. The wind seemed to die down as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. This was it. This was where it all happened. The place where his life had changed forever, where he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Luke swallowed hard, his throat dry. His legs felt like lead, every step toward the grave heavier than the last. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he forced himself forward, closing the distance between him and the grave. The air felt colder here, thicker, as if her spirit lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for him to come to her. When he finally reached the grave, his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. The damp earth soaked through his jeans, cold and unforgiving, but Luke barely noticed. His chest was tight, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he stared at the dirt that covered her, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a 1,000-pound weight. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. His throat tightened as the words left his mouth, as if speaking them aloud gave them a terrible, crushing weight. "I'm so sorry." The silence around him was deafening, the wind no longer howling, the trees no longer rustling. It was as if the world had gone still, listening to his confession. "I didn't mean to kill you," Luke continued, his voice trembling. "It was an accident. I swear it was. But I made a mistake. I buried you. I left you here, alone. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. I'm still scared." He was rambling now, the words spilling out of him like a dam that had finally burst. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his hands digging into the dirt, as if he could somehow pull her back from the grave, undo the terrible thing he had done. "I'm going to turn myself in," Luke choked out, his voice breaking. "I am going to confess. I'll pay for what I did. I'll tell everyone the truth. I'll do whatever it takes. Just, please, forgive me." The words hung in the air, heavy with desperation, with guilt, with fear. Luke bowed his head, his body trembling, as he waited for some kind of response, for anything to happen, and then he felt it. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that it felt like he had been plunged into a freezer. A faint whisper brushed past his ear, so soft that he wasn't sure if he had imagined it. Luke's heart seized in his chest, his breath catching in his throat as he lifted his head. The wind had picked up again, swirling around him, but the voice, it was unmistakable. It was her. "Please," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Please forgive me for a moment." Everything seemed to stop. The wind, the cold, the pounding of his heart, all of it seemed to fade into nothingness. The weight of her presence, the suffocating pressure that had followed him for so long, began to lift, like a heavy blanket being pulled off his chest. Luke's breath came easier, the tightness in his chest loosening just a little. Maybe, just maybe, she had heard him. Maybe she had forgiven him. But then, the cold came rushing back, more intense than before. The wind howled through the trees, and the air grew thick with something else, something darker. A low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing, and Luke's stomach twisted with dread. She wasn't gone. The weight of her anger hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with such force that he nearly fell backward. His body shook with fear, his heart racing as the realization set in. It wasn't enough. The forgiveness he had begged for, it wasn't enough. His confession, his promise to turn himself in, to face the consequences of his actions, it wasn't enough to undo the damage he had done. The woman's spirit, her pain, her rage, it wasn't going to fade so easily. "You can't run from this," a voice whispered in his ear, cold and venomous. "You'll never escape me." Luke's blood turned to ice. He could feel her now more strongly than ever before. She was close, so close that he could almost feel her breath on his skin, her fingers brushing against his neck. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, his muscles tensing as he fought the overwhelming urge to run. But he couldn't run, not this time. He had to face her. With trembling hands, Luke reached out, his fingers digging into the dirt, as if he could somehow make contact with her, with the woman he had buried so long ago. He closed his eyes, his breath shaky, as he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'll pay for what I've done. Please, let me make it right." The wind howled in response, the trees groaning under the weight of the storm that had begun to swirl around him. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into his bones, wrapping around him like chains. And then he felt a hand, cold and clammy, closing around his wrist. Luke's eyes flew open, his heart lurching in his chest as he looked down at his hand, half buried in the dirt. The pressure around his wrist tightened, pulling him down toward the ground, toward her grave. He tried to pull away, but it was no use. The hand, the cold, dead hand, was relentless, dragging him closer, pulling him into the earth. Panic surged through him, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps as he fought against the invisible force that had latched onto him. "Please," he cried out, his voice breaking. "I'll turn myself in. I swear I'll do it. Just let me go for a moment." The pressure around his wrist loosened, the cold hand releasing its grip. Luke scrambled back, his heart racing as he stared at the disturbed earth in front of him, his mind reeling with terror. The clearing was silent again, the wind dying down, the air still and thick with tension. Luke's breath came in ragged bursts, his body trembling, as he slowly backed away from the grave, his eyes never leaving the spot where he had felt her, where he had touched her. Was it over? Had she finally let him go? Luke's mind raced, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear, guilt and confusion. He had promised her that he would turn himself in, that he would confess everything. And he would. He had to. There was no other way. But the weight of her presence, the suffocating darkness that had haunted him for so long, it still lingered. She was still here. He could feel her, just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. This wasn't over. Not yet. Luke stumbled to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady beneath him. He took one last trembling look at the grave, at the mound of earth that had once been his secret, and now was his curse. "I'll do it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'll confess," and with that, he turned and fled, the wind howling behind him like a chorus of the dead, as the weight of his guilt followed him, clinging to his soul like a second shadow. He knew what he had to do. But even as he made his way back through the darkened woods, the cold still lingered, a chilling reminder that forgiveness might never come. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much he confessed, she would always be there, waiting. Part 7. Confession and Consequence. The sun had barely risen when Luke stood before the police station, its dull brick exterior looming over him like a monolith of judgment. The early morning air was cold, biting through his jacket, and yet it wasn't the chill of the wind that made his body tremble, it was the weight of what he was about to do. Luke stared at the heavy glass doors, his breath coming in ragged puffs. For the first time in months, the woman's ghost wasn't directly haunting him. She hadn't appeared last night, not at the foot of his bed, not in the corners of his vision. But that didn't mean she was gone. He could feel her presence still, like a dark cloud lingering on the edges of his consciousness, ready to descend at any moment. He had to do this. There was no other way. Swallow me bile that threatened to rise in his throat, Luke took a step forward, then another, his legs heavy as lead. Each footfall echoed in his ears, as though the ground itself was reminding him of his crime with every step. By the time he reached the entrance, his heart was pounding so loudly in his chest that it drowned out everything else, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of people on the street. It was all reduced to static, fading away in the shadow of his guilt. This was it, the moment of truth, the moment he had been dreading since that terrible night. Luke hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He could still turn back, he could still walk away, pretend this was all a bad dream, that he wasn't about to throw his life away. But the memory of her, the pale face, the accusing eyes, the bloodstains that trailed behind her held him in place. He couldn't escape her. He never would, not unless he confessed. Steeling himself, Luke pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lobby of the police station was quiet, the stereo lights casting a dull glow over the worn linoleum floor. A couple of officers sat behind a long desk, their heads down, sipping from steaming mugs of coffee. One of them, a woman with a tired expression and short, cropped hair, glanced up as he approached, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sized him up. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, though there was an edge of curiosity in her tone. Eventually, a different officer approached him, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern expression. "You said you need to report a crime," he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Luke nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The officer gestured for him to follow, and Luke rose shakily from his seat, trailing behind the man as they made their way down a long hallway to a small, windowless interrogation room. The walls were bare, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. The officer sat down across from him, pulling out a notebook. "All right," he said, pen in hand. "What's this about?" Luke's heart pounded in his chest, his hands shaking so violently that he had to press them against his thighs to keep them still. His mouth was dry, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him. "I killed someone," Luke blurted out, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer's expression didn't change, though his grip on the pen tightened slightly. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Start from the beginning," he said calmly. "Tell me what happened." And so Luke did. He told the officer everything about the night he had been driving with Jack, about the woman on the road, the terrible mistake he had made when he hit her, and the even worse decision he had made afterward when they buried her in the woods. Every detail spilled out of him like poison, his voice cracking as he relived the horror of that night. The officer listened intently, his expression unreadable as he scribbled notes in his pad. When Luke finished, there was a long, suffocating silence. The officer didn't speak for a moment, his pen hovering over the page as if he were contemplating what to say next. Finally, he set the pen down and met Luke's gaze. "And the body? You said you buried her?" Luke nodded, his stomach twisting. "Yes, in the woods near the old highway. I can take you there," the officer sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "This is a serious confession, son? You understand what's going to happen next, right?" Luke swallowed hard, his throat tight with fear. "I know," he whispered. "But I had to do it. I can't live with it anymore." The officer's expression softened slightly, though his voice remained stern. "All right, we'll have to verify your story. If we find the body, well, you're looking at a long time in prison. You understand that?" Luke nodded, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and relief. The prospect of prison terrified him, but it was nothing compared to the terror he had felt living with her ghost haunting him every day. This was his only chance at redemption, at peace. He had to see it through. "Take me there," the officer said, rising to his feet. "Show me where you buried her." The drive to the burial site was agonizingly long. Luke sat in the back of the police car, his hands cuffed in front of him, staring out the window as a familiar landscape blurred past. His mind was racing, his thoughts spiraling into a dark abyss of fear and regret. What if they didn't find her? What if she was gone? What if this didn't work? But even as his mind churned with doubt, he could still feel her presence, lingering at the edge of his awareness, waiting. The weight of her spirit hadn't lifted, and Luke knew deep down that confessing wasn't enough. He had made a promise to her, a promise to make it right, and until he did, she wouldn't leave him. The car finally came to a stop, and Luke was led out by the officers, his hands still cuffed. The woods stretched out before him, dark and foreboding, the trees swaying gently in the cold breeze. Luke's heart raced as he pointed toward the clearing where they had buried her, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Over there," he said, his voice shaking. "That's where we buried her." The officers exchanged a glance before leading him toward the spot. As they neared the clearing, Luke's stomach twisted with dread. The ground was just as he had left it, disturbed, but not enough to draw attention. The officers began digging, their shovels cutting into the cold earth, while Luke stood nearby, his hands trembling. Minutes passed, the sound of shovels scraping against dirt filling the air. And then finally one of the officers cursed under his breath as he hit something solid. "Got something," he muttered. Luke's heart dropped. He could feel it now, her presence growing stronger, more oppressive, as if she were watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment she could strike. The officer knelt down, brushing away the dirt, and Luke's stomach lurched as he saw the edge of a decayed piece of clothing partially exposed beneath the soil. They had found her. The officers worked quickly, uncovering the body, their faces grim as the reality of the situation settled in. Luke's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his chest heaving as a wave of nausea washed over him. He had done this. He had killed her. And now there was no turning back. One of the officers glanced at Luke, his expression hard. "Looks like you're telling the truth," he said. "You're going away for a long time." Luke nodded, his breath shaky. "I know, but even as the officers continued to dig, as they began calling in backup to handle the scene, Luke couldn't shake the feeling of her presence, still lingering, still watching. The weight of her spirit pressed down on him, suffocating him, as if her ghost was standing right behind him, waiting. He had confessed. He had told the truth. But it wasn't over. Not yet. As the police car drove him back to the station, the world outside the window blurred into a grey haze, and Luke's thoughts spiraled into darkness. He had done everything he could to make it right, but the cold presence that lingered at the back of his mind told him that it would never be enough. The woman's ghost was still there, her rage still burning, her spirit still bound to him. And Luke knew that no matter how much time he spent behind bars, no matter how many years he paid for his crime, he would never truly be free of her. Not in this life. Part 8. The Price of Redemption. Luke sat on the cold, hard bench of his cell, the iron bars looming in front of him like the unyielding lines of fate. The dim light overhead flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the grey concrete walls. The small window high up on the wall barely let in any sunlight, and the air inside the cell felt stale and suffocating, heavy with the smell of sweat, fear, and despair. He was alone. The steady drip of water echoed somewhere in the distance, a constant reminder of the slow, relentless passing of time. Each drop felt like a countdown ticking away the minutes until his life as he knew it would officially come to an end. His confession had been swift, and the police had wasted no time in charging him with manslaughter. The court proceedings had been scheduled, and his lawyer had tried to assure him that, given his voluntary confession, the sentence might be lenient. But none of that mattered to Luke. He wasn't afraid of prison. What truly terrified him, what kept him wide awake, staring at the ceiling in the dead of night, was the weight of her presence, still clinging to him like a cold, invisible shroud. Even after everything he had done, even after standing before the grave and baring his soul, even after walking into that police station and telling the world the truth, she was still there. The ghost hadn't left him. Luke squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the oppressive silence of the cell, but in the darkness behind his eyelids, the image of her face burned into his mind, the pale, lifeless eyes, the blood-soaked hair, the expression of cold, unrelenting rage. "You killed me," Luke, her voice whispered in his ears, soft and venomous, echoing through the empty spaces of his mind. No matter how hard he tried to push it away, it always returned. Her voice, her face, her accusation. He had thought that confessing, telling the truth, would bring him some measure of peace. He had thought that by facing his guilt head-on, he might be able to escape her. But now, sitting alone in his cell, he realized how wrong he had been. The spiritualist's words echoed in his mind, each syllable a dagger of truth that twisted deeper and deeper into his soul. Redemption doesn't come easy, Luke the spiritualist had told him, his voice grave and steady. The weight of guilt is tied to the soul, and it cannot be lifted with a simple confession. You've made a promise to yourself and to her. But the curse you carry is deeper than guilt. It is your soul that bears the mark of what you've done, and until that mark is cleansed, you will never be free. Luke had nodded at the time, his mind too consumed by fear and desperation to fully understand the spiritualist's warning. He had been so focused on confessing, on laying bare his sins to the world, that he hadn't truly considered what would come after. Now, in the suffocating silence of the cell, the weight of those words pressed down on him like a vice. The curse is tied to your soul, Dot. Luke shifted on the bench, his back pressing against the cold concrete wall. He could feel the chill seeping into his skin, sinking into his bones, and yet there was another coldness inside him, a deeper cold, one that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cell. It was the cold of her presence, the ghost who still lingered just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting, watching. He had thought that by confessing, by owning up to what he had done, he could sever the bond between them. But it hadn't worked. She was still with him. And the curse, whatever it was, however it worked, still held him in its icy grip. Luke ran a trembling hand through his hair, his fingers brushing against his scalp. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold. His heart raced, a steady drumbeat of fear that echoed in his ears. How long would this last? How long would he be trapped in this purgatory, haunted by the ghost of the woman he had killed? Was there no end to her torment? A soft rustle sounded in the corner of the cell, and Luke froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He strained to listen, his breath catching in his chest. It could have been a rat, he told himself, just a rat scurrying in the darkness. But deep down, he knew better. She was here. The air grew colder, the shadows in the cell shifting as if alive. Luke's throat tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He didn't want to look, he didn't want to see her, but he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, his head turned toward the corner, his eyes wide with terror. She stood there, half hidden in the shadows, her face pale and bloodless, her eyes hollow and accusing, her hair hung in damp, matted clumps, dripping with water or was it blood? Her clothes were torn, soaked through with the dark stains of her final moments. Luke's chest constricted, a wave of nausea rolling through him. His vision swam, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. Luke's chest tightened, the air in the cell growing thinner, colder, as if all the oxygen had been drained away. His vision blurred, his body trembling with the weight of her presence. "You'll never be free," she repeated, her voice echoing in his mind, in his very soul. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The air in the cell felt lighter, the shadows retreating back to their corners. But the coldness inside Luke remained, a gnawing, suffocating dread that pressed down on him with every breath. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He had thought that by confessing, by turning himself in, he could free himself from her. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The spiritualist had warned him redemption wasn't something that could be easily earned. It wasn't a transaction where guilt could be exchanged for absolution. It was a process, one that could take years or even a lifetime. And even then, there were no guarantees. "The curse is tied to your soul, Dot." Luke wiped at his eyes, his hands trembling. He had done everything the spiritualist had told him to do. He had confessed. He had taken responsibility for his actions. But the curse, the bond between him and the woman he had killed, was still there. He was still haunted. The night dragged on, the minutes stretching into hours as Luke sat in the cold, silent cell, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like an iron shackle around his neck. His mind raced, desperate for a solution, for some way to break the curse once and for all. But no matter how hard he thought, no matter how many scenarios he played out in his head, the answer remained the same. There was no escape. Luke's eyes burned with exhaustion, his body aching with the weight of his sleepless nights. He slumped back against the wall, his breath shaky, his heart pounding in his chest. He had thought that redemption would be simple, that by confessing, by owning up to his crime, he could earn some semblance of peace. But the spiritualist had been right. Redemption wasn't simple, it wasn't easy. It was a long, painful process, and Luke had only just begun. His soul was still stained with the weight of what he had done, and the ghost of the woman he had killed would not rest until that stain was wiped clean. Whether that would ever be possible, Luke didn't know. But for now, he had no choice but to wait and to hope that one day the ghost would leave him, hope that one day he might find peace. But as the hours passed, as the cold, suffocating presence of her ghost lingered at the edge of his mind, Luke knew, deep down, that peace was a long way off. The price of redemption was higher than he had ever imagined, and he wasn't sure if he could ever truly pay it. Part 9. A Watchful Spirit. The cell was quieter than it had ever been, but the silence did nothing to soothe Luke's nerves. The heavy iron bars, the cold concrete walls, and the dim light that flickered overhead all felt distant, like objects in a dream. He could hear his own breath slow, ragged, uneven as it echoed faintly in the small, enclosed space. Outside, the faint murmur of footsteps or the clinking of keys occasionally broke the silence, but inside the cell, it felt as though time had frozen. And in that stillness, Luke could feel her. Even though the ghost no longer materialized before him, her presence was there, lurking just beyond the edge of perception. It wasn't something he could see or hear, but he knew it deep in his bones, that she was always watching, always waiting. She never left. It was in the way the shadows in the corners of his cell seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, or how the air around him would grow inexplicably colder, sending a shiver down his spine. Sometimes in the middle of the night he'd wake up gasping, drenched in cold sweat, convinced that her icy breath was brushing against the back of his neck. The feeling was suffocating, like invisible chains wrapped tightly around him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The prison was supposed to be his punishment, his atonement for what he had done. And Luke had believed that by confessing, by throwing himself at the mercy of the law, he could break free of her. But prison bars couldn't hold a spirit. A confession couldn't erase the past. No matter what he did, no matter how much he suffered, she remained, always watching. Luke pressed his back against the wall, trying to steady his racing heart. His hands trembled as they clutched his knees, and his eyes flicked toward the small window at the top of his cell. The moonlight barely filtered through the thick glass, casting faint shadows that danced across the floor. Every flicker of movement caught his attention, his mind always on high alert, expecting to see her standing there, just out of reach. But she never appeared in the flesh anymore. That was what made it worse. There was no warning now, no sudden apparitions, no blood-soaked figure standing at the foot of his bed, just the unbearable tension of her constant presence, haunting him without ever revealing herself fully. The spiritualist's words haunted him as much as her ghost did. Some sins, Luke, cannot be buried. They linger, no matter how deeply you try to cover them up. The weight of what you've done of taking a life stains the soul, and that stain cannot simply be washed away. It clings to you, and the spirit of the wrong will always watch, always wait. Luke had scoffed at the idea at first, desperate to believe that there was a way to break free, a way to sever the connection between them. But now, sitting in the cold, unforgiving darkness of his prison cell, he understood. Some sins never die. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to pool, deeper and darker than the rest of the cell. His breath hitched in his throat. For a moment he thought he saw something, just the faintest outline of her form, standing there, watching him. Luke blinked hard, shaking his head, trying to rid himself of the image. "It's not real," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. She's gone, but the words felt hollow, empty, even to him. Deep down he knew the truth. She wasn't gone. She was never truly gone. He had confessed to the police, told them everything about the accident, about burying her body in the woods. They had found her, just like he said they would, and now he was paying for his crime. But no matter how many years he served, no matter how much time passed, it wouldn't undo the fact that he had taken her life. And for that she would never forgive him. Luke ran a hand through his hair, his fingers tangling in the strands as his heart pounded in his chest. The silence pressed in around him, thick and oppressive, like a living thing. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, as though her eyes were boring into him from the shadows, cold and accusing. He had tried to make things right, but there was no making this right. There was no atonement for something so finite. He had stolen her future, her chance to live, and no amount of guilt or regret could give that back to her. The shadows shifted again, and Luke's breath caught in his throat. This time he was certain he saw her just a flicker, a brief glimpse of her pale face staring out at him from the darkness. Her eyes were hollow, cold, devoid of life. He blinked, and she was gone. But her absence brought no relief. Luke stood abruptly, his legs shaky beneath him as he paced the small cell, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of her gaze, like icy fingers tracing his every move. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. No matter how many walls stood between them, no matter how many bars separated him from the outside world, she would always find him. Her spirit was tied to his guilt, bound to him by the curse of what he had done. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking in the stillness. "I'm so sorry," the words echoed back at him, meaningless in the face of the unrelenting silence. He had said them 1,000 times, both aloud and in his mind, but they brought no comfort. There was no one left to hear them, no one who could offer forgiveness, only her, and she would never forgive. As the night dragged on, Luke's exhaustion wore down his defenses. His mind was frayed, stretched thin by sleepless nights and the ever-present fear of what lingered in the darkness. He sat down on the edge of the narrow cot, his hands shaking as he rubbed his face, trying to stay grounded, trying to hold on to some semblance of reality. But the lines between reality and the spirit world were blurred now, distorted by guilt, by fear, by the knowledge that he had done something irreparable. "Do you think you deserve peace?" her voice echoed softly in his mind, a whisper that sent a chill down his spine. "Do you think you can simply move on?" Luke squeezed his eyes shut, his chest tightening as panic gripped him. "I'm trying," he choked out. "I've done everything I can. Please, let me go." But there was no answer. Just a suffocating silence, the unbearable weight of her presence, like a specter haunting his every breath. Time moved sluggishly, the hours blending together as Luke sat in the stillness, his mind unraveling with every passing second. He could no longer tell where one thought ended and another began. The constant pressure of her gaze bore into him, driving him to the edge of madness. At times he thought he could hear her footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoing down the hall outside his cell. Other times he imagined her standing just beyond the bars, waiting for him to look up, to acknowledge that she was still there, always there. And then, as the darkest hours of the night stretched on, Luke heard something else, something far more terrifying. It was a laugh. A soft, mocking laugh that echoed through the cell, faint at first but growing louder, more insistent. His blood ran cold as he sat up, his body trembling with fear. "Is this what you thought redemption would look like?" the voice asked, though it no longer sounded like the woman. It had taken on a more sinister tone, hollow and otherworldly. Luke's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block it out, trying to silence the voice. But the laughter grew louder, echoing in the corners of his mind, gnawing at him, unraveling him piece by piece. "You'll never escape," the voice hissed. "No matter how much you suffer, no matter how much you atone, you'll never be free." Luke's vision blurred, with tears as he hunched over, his body shaking with the weight of his fear and guilt. He had thought that by confessing, by turning himself in, he could free himself from her. But the spiritualist had been right all along. The curse was tied to his soul. No matter how deeply buried his sin, it would never die. It would live on, haunting him, waiting for the moment when his guard was down, when he was most vulnerable. The shadows in the cell seemed to grow darker, closing in around him, suffocating him. He could feel her now, her presence as cold and palpable as the steel bars that held him. She was watching, always watching, just out of sight, just beyond reach. Luke let out a shuddering breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The realization settled over him like a shroud, suffocating in its finality. Some sins could never be forgiven, and no matter how long he spent in this cell, no matter how much time passed, she would never truly be gone. She would always be there, a watchful spirit lurking in the shadows, waiting to remind him that some sins like hers never died, and neither would he.